The agenda this week looked for insights on the future of policing after the Ottawa Convoy, asked if municipal politicians needed greater oversight, and learned why the war in Ukraine means trouble for global food security. The Agenda's Week in Review begins with what wastewater signals suggest about a sixth wave of COVID-19.
It's been really a spectrum. There's been some public health units that have been extremely supportive of this and progressive and have looked at the data and said, we're going to use it for what it's worth and just use it as a complementary tool to all the other information we've had. While other public health units, and understandably so, have looked at the data and said, well, there's no real provincial guidelines, there's no real kind of script for us to follow in terms of how to really interpret this data. And that's completely understandable. So you see a spectrum across the province, and possibly at this point, you know, we alluded to this and talked about it, without the real kind of same critical mass of clinical data that we're able to see. I think the wastewater now is being more and more positioned as an important metric for us to really understand what's happening in our communities.
Claire, let me ask you about that. You know, Robert says it's understandable that some public health units want to sort of be stingy with that information, but do you think it's understandable that they're not as open as they perhaps could be or should be?
I think that, you know, wastewater surveillance data is, it's tricky data to work with. It can be variable from day to day, and that's just, I think, the nature of how the samples are collected in the analyses. And I think that, like Dr. Delatola alluded to, like very close relationships and communications between the research teams that are doing the analysis and the public health units is critical for interpreting the data and to see through some of that variability. Well, so I can understand if, you know, if those relationships don't get formed early on, then there could maybe be some trouble, you know, fully using the data for a specific public health unit. But in our experience in the city of Toronto, we've had like an excellent relationship with Toronto Public Health, and we really work with them as a cohesive unit to interpret the data that our lab is putting out.
Why do you think they've chosen to be particularly forthcoming when others have not been?
I think that they see the value in the data. They see the value of it as a complementary tool. In the city of Toronto in particular, and the data that's come out of our lab, we sample a lot of facilities as well, such as long-term care homes and homeless shelters. And I know that they've found that data very valuable. We've been able to catch outbreaks just before the clinical testing did. So, you know, the value at that scale became very clear to the public health unit early on.
Gustavo, let me follow up with you in this regard. More and more businesses across Ontario are now opening up, of course, and I wonder whether you are concerned that those businesses that do reopen more, with the potential for more information coming from them, will that somehow skew the data across the province? What's your view on that?
Well, you remember that this is a statistical problem at the end. I think we can modify our parameters in order to take in account this new situation.
And Claire, are there other sort of tricky things that you've got to be watching for as we sort of reopen the province more and more day by day?
Well, I think that maybe what your question alludes to is the fact that people are becoming more and more mobile, and their contribution to the wastewater samples that we're collecting may be coming from different places. And so that might be something that we need to take into consideration if we're trying to assign a certain level or trend to a specific area. And there is mobility data that, you know, you can use to understand how mobile a certain population that you're sampling is, and whether or not there's potential that they're contributing to the sample outside of their home area.
Got it. Robert, is it expensive to do this?
When you're comparing when you're comparing the cost associated with wastewater surveillance versus, testing, clinically testing like we did throughout the pandemic, a large number of people in a population base, it's really, really not. I think that's one of the benefits of wastewater surveillance. And an example is Ottawa's 1 million people. Throughout the pandemic, 500 to 4,000 people were tested daily here in order to understand prevalence and incidence of the disease. We collected one wastewater sample every day. And not to say that the metrics were equivalent, but that wastewater sample also gave us an indication of whether, there was spread, transmissibility within the province. So cost effectiveness, the economic aspect is a benefit of wastewater surveillance.
This has happened many, many times before. There's been a protest, there's been convoys before. They've come to town, they've done their protest, and then they've left. And that was the expectation, I think, for the most part, as to what was going to happen this time. I personally got a sense of a huge shift that occurred. And I would agree, I don't think the individual officers' actions were nearly as important as some people would like to make it out. What I saw as a really ground swelling shift was when the money, the millions of dollars started rolling in through the GoFundMe, the Give, Send, Go, and then ultimately Bitcoin. Protesters that would otherwise have been expected to leave town suddenly were offered financial assistance to stay in town. They didn't have to worry about paying tickets. They didn't have to worry about buying gas for their vehicles. They didn't have to worry about accommodation. And they didn't have to worry about losing their trucks if the trucks were seized. It changed, in my view, the relationship between the police and the demonstrators and the city. And I know that as a board, one of the questions I asked is, and one of the things I never understood is, why were trucks allowed to re-enter the city after they had left the demonstration? And then we saw trucks that were re-entering. And that made no sense to me. And that was one of the questions. As a board, our role is to ask questions, to have a robust mechanism to ask questions. And we asked, why are these trucks being allowed to re-enter? And the answer we were given was that the protesters had a charter right to bring their vehicles downtown. That made no sense to me. But this, in part, is part of the difficulty the board has. We don't have the resources to challenge the powers that be, the chief, the senior executive. These are the knowledgeable people. They have their legal counsel present. The city's legal counsel is present. So when we're given an answer like that as a board, we don't have the ability to challenge it. But it didn't make sense. And I think it was something that allowed the protest to go on longer. But in addition, there were other issues.
Well, hang on. Don't get to the other issues yet, because we've got a lawyer here, and I want to pursue that idea of they had a charter right to protest, to assemble, to have those trucks in the shadow of Parliament Hill. Okay, Karima, you're a lawyer. Does that make sense to you?
That does not make sense to me. There is, of course, charter rights that protect political expression, the right to assembly, so on and so forth. But there's nothing specifically that allows for the use of commercial vehicles as a tool of protest, especially where there is ample evidence that these vehicles were detrimental, whether it was through the honking, through the idling and the noise pollution, the fumes coming out. The charter is right there in Section 1. There are limits that can be imposed.
No, there are limits,
that's something that would be litigated after the fact. But I don't see that using a truck is something that the charter protects.
No, I appreciate that there are limits on all of our fundamental freedoms in this country. Having said that, it's right there in black and white in the charter. We do have the freedom to assemble. And that's what they were doing. They were assembling. Now, obviously, they had trucks, they had horns, et cetera, et cetera. Could they reasonably conclude that they were in compliance with the charter?
I believe that many thought that they were in compliance with the charter, and the way that it was enforced gave them reason to think that. But the logistics of this type of operation, preventing the actual trucks, does not mean that you're preventing an individual from protesting. And so the truck and the person are not inseparable.
John, just because your metaphors are so fantastic, I want to put a follow-up question to you if I can here. And that is, it does focus on the Ottawa example and Councillor Chiarelli, who has gotten himself into a great deal of trouble over the last years. And apparently all council could do was dock his pay for 15 months. Do you think we need a change in procedures in Ontario whereby if somebody behaves egregiously, his or her colleagues can say, you know what, we're impeaching you and we're kicking you out of your seat because you've gone beyond the pale? What's your view on that?
Well, that's a really tough one because you see such terrible behavior in some municipalities that you say, hey, that should be the result. The problem with that is, Steve, is that most places, most assemblies do not allow their own members to kick out a fellow member because that would be the tyranny of the majority, right? They'd be perhaps not liking the maverick views of a particular member of whether it's the council or the assembly, and all of a sudden feel that it's appropriate for them to remove them. Now, the province is looking at things like this. There was a huge consultation commenced last year by the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing to look at what to do with members. Alberta passed recall legislation, not only for local members, but also for members of the Legislative Assembly and for school boards. So there are at play certain initiatives to bring forward greater penalties. But your point is well taken. There's only 2 penalties that are authorized under the Municipal Act for a breach of a code of conduct. One is a reprimand, which is a slap on the wrist. We don't think you're doing very well. We're going to denounce that. And the other one is a suspension of pay for up to 90 days. Of course, Rick Chiarelli had 5 separate instances. So 5. Thank you, Joanne. There was 5 separate instances. So 90 times 5 is 450 days, which is over a year of free work by this council member, which some members would say, hey, he shouldn't be there at all. I think I agree with them.
I want Joanne to pick up on that, if you would. How much appetite was there on council? And we should stress, Councillor Chiarelli defends his innocence in all of these matters, but how much appetite was there among his fellow councillors to have him thrown off council altogether, even though that wasn't an option?
After the second report came out, the Integrity Commissioner brought it forward and council voted on it. They immediately and unanimously passed a motion asking him to resign. Minister Stephen Clark, he is the Minister of the Municipal Affairs and Housing, personally also asked him to resign, which is unheard of. And of course, he has said no. He is still on council. He's getting his pay again as of late last year. But, even while he was being unpaid, he was a counselor, he was collecting his pension. And it is amazing. Every time I talk about this story, we've done a lot of coverage of this here at CBC. I'm on the air. I get letters all the time asking, well, why is he still here? When is he leaving? And it was interesting. The public was just not aware that there's no mechanism for removing someone from office. And it's pretty interesting because there are mechanisms if you breach a financial rule. For example, there was the case of Jim Karagannis in Toronto, spent too much money on his celebration party after the 2018 election. He broke some financing rules, and he is literally no longer a councillor, but someone who has broken behavioral rules, codes of conduct to a quite shocking degree. There's really no way to remove them from their elected seats, and people were shocked by that. There's a huge move in Ottawa to change the rules.
I'm going to start our discussion just by reading an excerpt from the New York Times, this from last week, and it goes like this. For the global food market, there are few worse countries to be in conflict than Russia and Ukraine. Over the past 5 years, they have together accounted for nearly 30% of the exports of the world's wheat, 17% of corn, 32% of barley, a crucial source of animal feed, and 75% of sunflower seed oil, an important cooking oil in some parts of the world. David M. Beasley, the executive director of the United Nations World Food Program, said Ukraine has only compounded a catastrophe on top of a catastrophe. There is no precedent even close to this since World War II. Earthrin, I wonder, having heard what David Beasley had to say about this, I wonder how you would characterize the pressure now being felt on the global food supply.
David's absolutely right. This is a looming, as the Secretary General has said, hurricane on the horizon. I was serving as the U.S. Ambassador for Food and Agriculture in the aftermath of the 2007-8 food crisis and during the 2011 high food price hunger crisis. And what we saw then was that was when hunger spiked around the world to about 1 billion people. And we know that today, as we are speaking, there are 811 million people who are food insecure. And that number increased by about almost 100 million as a result of COVID. And there's an expectation that this situation, and this is just a tipping point of challenges that had already begun because of lack of fertilizer, high gas prices, the spike in wheat futures, and then you have this availability challenge that results from the lack of export from Russia and Ukraine. And so that number of 811 billion, some are speculating, could again increase to over 1 billion people. And the number of those who are critically, acutely hungry could increase from the 276 million today to another 100 to 150 to over 350 million people who are acutely hungry. And that means without assistance, there will be famines.
Evan, you just heard me read that quote from David Beasley from the UN World Food Program saying this was a catastrophe on top of a catastrophe. Is that being overly dramatic?
No, I mean, I agree with Ambassador Cousin here. I mean, and the head of the World Food Program. Any one of the problems that Ambassador Cousin just listed on their own wouldn't necessarily trigger a global crisis. But when you've already got high food price inflation, supply chain bottlenecks, low food stocks. This is another thing. The United Nations tracks something called the supply to use ratio, which basically is a fancy way of saying how much food we've got versus how much we use. And the supply to use ratio is at its lowest point since I think 2015 or 2016. So you put all of these things together and you do have layers of catastrophe and a cascading ripple effect that means that when you take Russia and Ukraine, which are amongst the world's top 5 wheat exporters, out of the equation for this year, wheat importing countries such as Egypt and North Africa, the Middle East, will be in desperately troubled situations, and then the looming specter of famine and skyrocketing hunger around the planet. It's a terrifying moment.
Lenore Newman, if you're a farmer in Ukraine right now, you obviously can't do what you want to do when there are bombs dropping all around you. So what's not happening right now that should be happening?
Yes, well, obviously in Ukraine, we are seeing total disruption of the farming cycle for the most part. It's a long-held historic truth that war is particularly hard on farmers. But I think I have to stress, as my colleagues mentioned, it's the waves of disruption flowing out from that are particularly damaging. And I don't know that we've entirely mentioned yet the disruption of fertilizer flow from Russia and Ukraine is also critical, and that's impacting South America and Africa and the entire world as well. And as it has been mentioned as well, it's on top of 3 years of basic constant disruption, climate change, pandemic. And I'm usually an optimist, and I usually say, a one-off situation. The food system is really good at being resilient. This time, there's fatigue. There's disaster fatigue, one could say.
That's just some of what we covered this week. You can find the full conversations on our website, tvo.org, our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda, or our Twitter feed, twitter.com/theagenda.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.